Amandla. Amandla. Oliver Tambo savela huya. Oya bezwa. Nelson Mandela. Oya bezwa. Peter Mukaba. Oya bezwa. Amakerela. Nelson Mandela. Oya bezwa. Peter Mukaba. Nawe slofu. Amakerela. Amandla. Amandla. Viva ANC, viva. Viva SSCP, viva. Viva Kosatu, viva. Viva Sanko, viva. Malibongwe. Igama lamakhosikazi. Roar young lions, roar. Roar young lions, roar. Uzoyithola kanjani? Uhlele khoneni. Amandla. Viva all of you, viva. Viva all of you, viva. Long live the fighting spirit of OR Tambo, long live. Long live the fighting spirit of OR Tambo, long live. No, thanks, Comrade Matodzi, for that introduction. Let me also thank the program director, the deputy chairperson of the Youth League in this region, Comrade Andisani. Let me also thank the ANC Youth League, Vhembe region, under the leadership of Comrade Tumelo Silinga, for inviting me to remember the longest ANC president, OR Tambo. Comrade, there's a lot to say about Oliver Tambo, and I've chosen to focus on a few things. Basically two things, if not three. One, on his understanding and solution or answer to what we call the national question. His internationalism, which is more important in this period wherein the apartheid Israel state is continuing with its genocide against the Palestinian people. And I'll say a few things about the leadership of OR Tambo and what are the lessons that we can draw from OR Tambo in uniting, firstly, our people and the ANC and our movement broadly. Because the topic that I've been given, it's about unity of the movement and the unity of our people or society in general. I have written the speech, but because of time, I'm not going to read it. I'll speak to it. I'll skip some of the things that are in the speech. I'll circulate the speech after its presentation, hopefully tomorrow, Comrade Tumelo. I'll have to edit it based on the conversation and the feedback that I'm going to have. And let me observe all the protocols, and I stand on the protocols that have been established already, acknowledging all comrades, leaders of our movement. So I won't repeat the acknowledgement because I think that has been eloquently done already by comrades. So, like I said, I've been asked to talk about the unity of our movement, the ANC, as well as the unity of South Africa, our people. It's always important to define things, because if we don't define things, we think that we are talking about the same thing, yet we are not. So if we say go and get me a sheep, mbudzi, as an example, you must have a conception what a goat is. Otherwise, you'll bring me a lion. So it's always important to start with what exactly we're talking about. Because definitions in our daily conversations and in politics are quite important. A necklace in the 80s in Soweto meant something different to people of England in the same period. When we said necklace in Soweto in the 80s, it meant that people are going to put tire on you and burn you. That was a necklace. But in Britain, it meant a different thing. So it's important to always define and be clear what we're talking about. And my purpose today, it's not to give you a chronology of when was O.R. Tambo born and all that, because I assume that you know that as leaders and members of the ANC Youth League on who O.R. Tambo was. But I'll talk about what he stands for. And one of the things that he stood for was unity. But what is unity? Unity is about togetherness. And we always say unity is strength. And whether we're talking about the unity of lifeless objects, Matombo as an example. If stones are together, they're very strong. And that is why sometimes if you want stones, you have to break those stones so that they're in pieces and carry them bit by bit to where you want them to go. And therefore, we should guard jealously on the unity of our movement, because it's only when we are strong that we'll be in a position to do the things that we've got to do. If we are weaker, like any other object, whether it's an object which has no life, or even objects that have life, like animals or ants or bees. Bees are stronger when they are together. It's easy for you to attack one bee and kill it. But if they come in mass, all of you will run away. But if it's one, you are able to defeat it. But unity of human beings is conscious. It's unlike unity of ants and bees, which is instinct. They follow their instinct. As human beings, we are conscious beings. We're clear with a purpose on why we unite. So, as human beings, we unite for particular purposes. And O.R. Tambo united the ANC, sought the unity of the people of South Africa in order to build a different nation. So he was responding to colonialism. He was seeking to solve what we call the national question. So what is the question in the national question? We talk a lot about the national question. The question in the national question is about who belong to a country, to a territory. And this question has been answered differently. Some said a nation, it's because you speak the same. A nation is a nation because you belong to a particular race. So as you all know that you did not have a nation called South Africa before 1910. This nation called South Africa in 1910 was formed out of 4 political sovereigns. It was the Transvaal, Natal, Free State, and which one? The Cape. They fought the Anglo-Boer War as you know it. And after the fight, they said, okay, let's form a nation called South Africa. And they asked a question, who should this South Africa belong to? So the colonial answer to the national question was that South Africa only belonged to white people. So they used race as a criteria according to which you belong to a nation. O.R. Tambo belonged to the second generation of African revolutionaries who answered this question on who South Africa belonged to. And he answered it differently. The first generation of the African revolutionaries, Vhembe, founder of the ANC, many of them born in the 1860s, 70s, 90s, studied outside South Africa because the only university for blacks, I think, was established in 1916, Fort Hare. But many of them came from missionary schools, Lovedale, and many other colleges. Vhembe's call was that we've been fighting as Africans, divided. Venda-speaking people fighting led by Makado, Ngungunyane, leading Chitsonga, Shangan people, Shaga, Zulu, Hintsa, Xhosa, Mshweshwe, Sotho, and so on and so on. They said the best way for us to fight against colonialism is for us to unite as African people. And that's why they formed the African National Congress 2 years after the formation of South Africa, because the way in which the colonial power answered the national question was racist. It excluded black people in general and Africans in particular. Fast forward, because the method through which the first generation of the African revolutionaries who founded the ANC, their method of struggle was largely through petition. Fast forward, the leadership of O.R. Tambo answered the national question differently. Because they said in the Freedom Charter, South Africa belonged to all who live in it, black and white. And in 1969 Morogoro Conference, which I'll come back to, O.R. Tambo said, we cannot talk about a non-racial South Africa when, as the African National Congress, we don't have other national groups as members. What we're seeking to build as our future must show in who we are today organizationally. So who we are today must prefigure the future that we're seeking to build. Because before that, before the ANC admitted other national groups, colored people, Indian people, white people. All those people, they have their own organizations. The African National Congress was an organization of Africans of African origin, you and I. I say you and I because many of us here have not seen an African of Asian origin or an African of European origin. It's all of us who are here as African of African origin. And I'll come back to why I'm saying African of African origin, African of Asian origin, or Indian origin, as it were. So these organizations were fighting separately. Semi-rightly so, when he formed the ANC, he united Africans who were fighting divided ethnically, and united them. Tambo takes it forward. So this generation is not a generation that only changed the forms of struggle, but they also answered the national question differently. So they say, South Africa, so they give a different answer to the national question, which is, who's a member? If we are to constitute a nation, who should be a member? And O.R. Tambo's generation, which, as I said, is a generation, it's a second generation of modern political leadership. And this generation took the struggle to new heights. And it's a generation, lot of them, in fact, almost of them, they studied at Fort Hare. Mandela, Sibukwe, and even amongst them, as they formed the ANC Youth League, they answered this question differently. Because in 1955, when the Freedom Charter is adopted, the ANC only adopted the Freedom Charter in 1956. Precisely because there were differences on who does South Africa belong to. Some were saying Africa for Africans. White people must be driven to the sea. And that's why you eventually saw the formation of the PAC. But the generation of O.R. Tambo said, no, South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, but it's not enough for us to say we belong to the same country and not change the power relations. How do we live together? Politically, we need to be democratic. What does it entail? Everyone has a right to be elected. People must govern. How? They should have their representatives. They must have direct democracy. Things that we take for granted today. So this generation of O.R. Tambo provided different vision on how South Africa look like or should look like. So I challenge you as this generation to say, how should a non-racial South Africa look like? What type of policies should we be pushing, and a program that we should be pushing, both in government, in the movement, internationally, to drive the vision, the society that you seek to build? Well, I don't think it's sufficient for us to say we're building a non-racial, non-sexist, democratic South Africa. From the youth league of today, or young people of today, what should that entail? Let me also come to OR and internationalism. O.R. Tambo, he was not just preoccupied with the national struggles, because he understood that for South Africa to be the country of peace, democracy, unity, it needs an international environment that is conducive for that, and we should treat human beings as human beings regardless of where they are. So, and for any revolution, and part of the reason that we continuously do this thing of international balance of forces as a movement is because we think, and rightly so, that the international situation has an impact on what we do today. So, O.R. Tambo believed in the struggle of the Palestinian people. And let me quickly go through, because I'm sure you're reading a lot today about the Palestinian question, Israel conflict, and all that. O.R. Tambo, including his last days, he said, we need to pledge solidarity with the Palestinian people. What O.R. Tambo, the reason why he said so is precisely because just like us, who were colonized, the Palestinian people were also colonized. What is called Palestine today, Israel today, before the mass migration of, or organized mass migration of the Jewish people lived together in that part of the world peacefully. And Jewish people generally, they are disparate. There are many in many parts of the world, including here in Vhembe, black Jews are they are all over. So even Palestine, what you call present, they were living peacefully with the Arab people under the Ottoman Empire at some point. There were three types of migration of the Jewish people into Palestine. Taking into account there were already some of them there living side by side with the Arab people. The first migration, mass migration, organized migration, was for religious reasons. Going to Jerusalem, Hebron, and treated that part of the world as a holy place for them, as a place of worship. But the second organized mass migration was no longer religious, but it was political, in which the British Empire, which had colonized many parts of the world, said we must encourage. Of course, there were already political Zionists who were seeking to build a nation state only for the Jewish people. And the British said in order for them to weaken the Ottoman Empire, they must encourage the settlement of the Jewish people in Palestine, practicing differential treatment of the people who were living together peacefully by taking away their land, preferring to give more land to the Jewish people. The second phase of organized mass migration of the Jewish people into Palestine, because this is important, comrade, because we are in a campaign in solidarity with the Palestinians. It's important for us to ground it historically and understand it politically. And O.R. Tambo, as I said, he stood with the Palestinian people. The second organized migration was after Hitler killed lots of Jews in Europe, including in Germany. Post the Second World War, instead of integrating the Jewish people into Europe, Germany. The drive was that the Jewish people should be encouraged to go to Palestine. That was the second organized mass migration into Palestine, which was accompanied by the dispossession of the Palestinians of their land. Fast forward, today people are saying to solve the problem in Palestine, you need to have what is called two-state solution. So you need to have a state for the Palestinians and a state for the Jewish people. The ANC of Palestine, PLO, historically disagreed with this two-state solution as part of solving the national question in Palestine. They said, we need one nation, should live in diversity, our religious diversity should be celebrated. Our ethnic diversity should be celebrated. Should not be the basis for political divisions. But the political Zionists said no. Like the apartheid here said, to build a nation, you must build it ethnically. Like we had during apartheid, where you had Bantustan, a nation for Vhembe people, Xitsonga, Machangan people, and Gazankul, and so on and so on. PLO in Palestine said no. And it was not only the PLO, John Garang in Sudan disagree with the separation of Sudan along racial or ethnic lines or religious lines. So people are pushing the idea that let's have a two-state solution. O.R. Tambo, including here in South Africa, there were people who were saying to solve a national question in South Africa, maintain apartheid, divide people ethnically. To solve the national question in South Africa, divide South Africa along ethnic lines, including racial lines. O.R. Tambo did not support this, including when we were fighting for our liberation here in South Africa. Comrades, we are seeking to build a nation. We are seeking to unite the South Africa in which race, gender, age, ethnicity should not matter. Let me quickly turn to what I call the objective and the subjective conditions that unite South Africa, and the objective and the subjective condition that divide South Africa, and what should be our tasks as young revolutionaries to deal with that problem. I'm sure many of you, you talk about objective factors and subjective factors. By objective conditions, we mean things that are independent of you. So this world exists independent of whether I think or not. It's an objective reality. How I deal with it depends on my subjectivity. Do I want it white? Do I want to demolish it? Do I have the capacity to do that? It lies in me. So by objective conditions, we're talking about the things that exist independent of whether we think they exist or not. It's an objective reality. So one of the objective realities that we have post-apartheid South Africa, which enables us to unite, to build a united nation that O.R. Tambo envisioned, is the Constitution of South Africa, because it has ended discrimination. It has built one nation state. It has banned discrimination on the basis of race, ethnicity, and so on and so on. And O.R. Tambo was very central in crafting this constitution. And I think we also need to dispel the notion that a constitution that is blocking transformation. It is not. It is our subjective capacity and the political will that will determine whether we drive the socio-economic transformation to build a new nation in which all of us, we feel that we are part, because we cannot be part of what is called South Africa when economically a lot of black people are deprived. It's not the constitution which is the problem. The constitution is very radical. It talks about the right to life. Ourselves as this generation, we should be saying, under these political conditions of the constitutional democracy, what does the right to life mean? You cannot live if you don't have land. That's what we should be campaigning around. That for us to live, because you need food. To live, you need food. And where do you get food from? You get it from the land. So I do think that as this generation, we should be using this constitution revolutionary to organize around it. We talk about the freedom of speech in the constitution. The Youth League should be saying, how do we have a freedom of speech if we don't have Wi-Fi? If we don't have the means to communicate? We have the freedom of movement, but there's a lot of things that makes it difficult for us to move. If you need employment, it's costly. You've got to go to interviews and all that. Shouldn't be the Youth League be saying, for young people to have the freedom of movement, they need free vouchers to get into buses and so on and so on. How do you look for employment? If you cannot move. So I do think that we need to take this constitution seriously, because it does provide a very good basis for us as this generation to take the revolution forward. So I do not think that the constitution in any way is an impediment to our radical socio-economic transformation, including on expropriation of land without compensation. The constitution is not an impediment. Yes, if we wanted to make it more explicit as the ANC, but we could not succeed in doing that in Parliament. Let me come to the second, another objective conditions that set conditions for us to make it difficult for us to build a united nation. Comrade, our economy is capitalist. And what that means is that every human being, for them to live, they depend on the market. For you to get food, you need to have money in order to buy that food. So you must have money. For business people, for them to be successful, they need to sell something in the market. If they are not successful in selling something in the market, they are out. And what that does, it generates competition. Competition for employment, competition for tenders, competition for business opportunities. So capitalism divides instead of uniting. But there's another dimension of capitalism, which is uniting. That it brings people, as you industrialize, it tends to bring people under one roof, put them through unions, for unions to come together and fight for them, for better wages and so on and so on. But the economic system that we have generates competition for resources, which takes place in different forms. And some of these forms may also take an ethnic form. The second objective conditions in which we live in the post-apartheid South Africa, which goes against what O.R. Tambo stood for, is that we have not successfully dismantled the apartheid geography. Our settlements still reflect largely what apartheid designed. The Zulu-speaking people are still concentrated in Zululand. We have not been able to break that apartheid geography. And this sets, in the absence of revolutionary organizations, this set the material conditions for ethnic politics to thrive, in which people begin to organize ethnically and racially. But we do have subjective conditions which enable us to unite the nation, and that is, comrade, the presence of the ANC, its continued it's an asset to the unity of this country. Many of the comrades I know throughout the country, I know them because of the ANC. If it wasn't for the ANC, we'll still be operating in those Bantustan and not knowing each other, and knowing each other ethnically, and not knowing each other as comrades. So ANC unites. So the ANC is a subjective factor. The Youth League, SSCP, Young Communist League, these are important for us to continue fighting for a united society, a united South Africa. And the values of OR Tambo are quite important in this regard. But we cannot talk about these things without dealing with the economic development, and I do go throughout the paper on what that should entail in terms of building the economy, because if we don't address unemployment, address shortage of electricity, people will yearn for the yesteryear Bantustan government. Let me quickly turn to OR Tambo and the unity of the ANC, and how OR Tambo envisioned the ANC and how he basically led the African National Congress. So, I'm going towards closure, comrade. So, when OR Tambo left the ANC, he had this to say, and I want to quote OR Tambo. This was 33 years ago, in December 1990. He had this to say: I devotedly watch over the organization all these years. I now hand it over to you, bigger, stronger, intact, guard against any destruction of our precious movement. Close quote. The key question that we need to be asking today as this generation is, are we guarding this precious movement of OR Tambo? Are we going to leave it bigger, stronger, and intact? I'm not so sure if all of us here will answer this in the affirmative because of the many challenges that our movement is facing. Factionalism, low levels of political education, and other isms that are very destructive to the ANC and are also leading to the separation between the ANC and the people. And we see that in the local government elections. The metros in many parts of our country, we've not been successfully elected into running them. OR Tambo built the organization through accepting criticism. When there was Wonky Wonky campaign, which was a campaign undertook by Zebra forces here in Zimbabwe together with MK, people like Chris Hani were eventually arrested. And that led to call for the renewal of the ANC, because at that time, many leaders and members of the ANC felt that the ANC is focusing on international work and not building the organization internally in the country. As Mzala will say, you cannot cook the rice out of the pot. You've got to cook the rice in the pot. So for us to make a revolution, we ought to struggle within South Africa. OR Tambo was criticized. According to one of the writer of his biography, which I think you need to read, she says that OR Tambo was criticized as a globe trotter, someone who's focusing on international work and not focusing on building the movement internally. People such as Chris Hani, who were central in criticizing the leadership under OR Tambo, were punished and were nearly military executed. And Chris Hani does accept that if it wasn't for OR Tambo, he would have been executed for criticizing the leadership. And the question is, and I have a quote there which I won't quote because of time, on how Chris Hani reflected on this experience. The question is, can we say this about our leadership at all levels? Is a criticism of the Youth League, of our leadership, and the criticism of the ANC Youth League leadership by its own members, and at different level, taken comradely. I'm not so sure if we can answer this question also in the affirmative, because sometimes as leadership, we are very rank conscious and not follow logic in our debates and discussion. OR Tambo prepared seriously for any meeting. He will research topics and make sure that by the time he comes to the meeting, he's really prepared. But OR Tambo was not an angel. He had his own mistakes. And again, according to Luli Kalunikas, she used the word that OR Tambo in Morogoro, when things were hot, and I'm quoting Luli here, she says OR Tambo threw tantrums. And no one was shocked when the debates were hot and some of the people unfairly criticizing OR Tambo. It took J.B. Marks to bring OR Tambo back into the organization and into the leadership. And the lesson that we must draw from this, comrade, is that we must not celebrate or rejoice expulsion of members and when members leave the organization. We must do what J.B. Marks used to do, which is to ensure that we value every member of the organization. We keep them in our organization. OR Tambo was not a power monger. always preparing for the next conference immediately after the end of one conference. He handed the leadership very smoothly because he was not a power monger. In conclusion, I want to say, comrades, let's build the ANC like O.R. Tambo and leave it bigger and stronger. How should we do that? We need to take seriously political education. And you don't need big meetings for political education. You can pull the Freedom Charter, sit under the tree with a few comrades and say the Freedom Charter says the people shall govern. What does it mean? The economic clause of the Freedom Charter says the following things. Have we achieved those things? Take the strategy and tactics of the ANC, read it, debate it. You don't need big resources to do that. Let's leave the ANC bigger and stronger by having a campaigning ANC, because many of our branch meetings are election driven. We convene either to elect a BEC or to prepare for the local government elections or national elections. Outside that, we don't take up issues of our people. If we are able to take up issues of our people, campaigning will be very easy. People will not be, immediately this election, they will do on their own, go and vote the African National Congress. So we cannot be an electionist party which is only focusing on elections, whether internally or externally. And the Youth League is quite central in this regard, and young people have a lot of energy, and those who say young people can't be in governance and all that, they forget that Jesus Christ, by the time he got crucified, he was 32. And look at the Christian movement today. It's quite big, built by a young person because of energy and the ability to do this. Let's build an ANC Youth League, but different of the O.R. Tambo generation, different in this respect. One of the weaknesses of the ANC Youth League of O.R. Tambo and Mandela is that it was largely rooted among students. It was largely rooted among students. It had no young workers, young peasants, unemployed youth. So as a youth league, as a youth movement, it will be important for us to think, to look at ourselves and say, who is the member of the ANC Youth League? What is the percentage of students that we have in the ANC Youth League? What is the percentage of young workers, the unemployed, the professionals, and so on and so on? Because it will be important for us to reflect what the youth is today in South Africa. We should not have just one section of the youth in the ANC Youth League. It should be a youth that represent the different positionalities of the young people in society. Comrade, let's go and build a bigger ANC, a bigger ANC Youth League, which is stronger and capable of taking forward the National Democratic Revolution. Thank you very much.